Okay, so last time we lectured on Monday, we left off talking about the ways that we inhale and exhale, collectively performing the respiratory cycle. We learned that it had everything to do with pressure gradients. Okay, pressure gradients that we talked a lot about related to that Boyle's law that we saw, where pressure was inversely related to the volume inside of a closed container. And that's how we breathe, and the mechanisms related to inspiration and expiration. We're going to be dealing a lot more with pressure gradients. We've been talking a lot about pressure gradients as of late, with the flow of blood, both in blood vessels in the heart, and now breathing, and what we'll talk about today with oxygen, carbon dioxide, both in our lungs and in our tissues. Okay. Before we do that, though, let's talk here for a couple of slides about pulmonary volumes and pulmonary capacities. I know there's a few things you need to write out here, so I'll give you guys a couple minutes. Do something. At rest, where you guys are all in a state of right now, and which you guys are all in a state of right now, it's going to take about an average of 12 breaths a minute. And that includes an inhale and an exhale, because it's one singular breath. And with each inhale and exhale, there's a specific volume of air that moves in and out of the lungs. Okay. A spirometer is a device or apparatus that states there used to measure this volume of air exchange in breathing. There are 4 volumes that can be measured with the spirometer, and there are tidal volume, expiratory reserve volume, inspiratory reserve volume, and residual volume. I gave you their abbreviations. I would never just give you the abbreviation without giving you the full name. Okay, so you're not going to just need to know tidal volume is TV. I would abbreviate it, but I would always give you the real name first. Okay, it helps to have the abbreviations because that's what's used a lot of times, especially here for the calculation of pulmonary capacities. And then you have some of the things to write on this page. So go ahead and do that right now. We're going to flip here in a second to the figure that I just showed you. Accidentally, I didn't mean to go 2 slides ahead. But that is the figure that we'll look at here, showing both volumes and capacities. I'm going to kind of bounce back and forth between these 3 slides. The previous slide on volumes, this slide on capacities, and then the figure on the following page. Now, what capacities are? They're the sum of either 2 or more pulmonary volumes. So taking those volumes that were on the previous page, adding them together. Okay, you've got vital capacity, inspiratory capacity, functional residual capacity, and then total lung capacity. A spirometer is a pretty cool device. If we had a physical lab, we would actually bring one in and we could measure some of these things and then calculate some capacities. Fortunately, since the lab's completely online, we don't get a chance to do that. I would love to get a digital one. Digital spirometers are really accurate and pretty amazing at what they can provide for you. So maybe someday I can bring one in, but that won't really do you guys any good. So too bad. All right, looking at the figure here, this is what a spirometer readout would look like. You can see over there, kind of in towards the back end of our graph, or figure, whatever you want to call it, is where the record would actually start. And you can see hopefully the reason why we call tidal volume tidal volume. It looks like the flow of the tide, up and down, up and down, up and down. Okay. Tidal volume, if I go back to the previous page on volume, described as the volume of air normally exhaled after a typical inspiration. So basically it's the amount of air that we breathe in with a normal breath. Okay, and therefore we also normally exhale it. Okay, because with a spirometer, a lot of times what you're measuring is actually the air going out. Okay, the one that I have in Holton, that's how it works. Okay, you blow air into a tube. The tube makes a big old bell float more in water that it's submerged in. Okay, so how we measure tidal volume with that is the individual would take a normal inhale, and then they'd put their mouth on the mouthpiece and just take a normal exhale. Okay, and then that provides us with tidal volume. About 500 mils. About 70% of that actually reaches the respiratory zone, so about 350 mils. That leaves about 30% or 150 mils not receiving or not reaching the respiratory zone. We talked about the respiratory zone the other day. That's going to be the alveoli and structures right there next to it. That's important because that's the place where gas exchange takes place. Conducting zone, we said, were just the tubes or conduits for air to make its way to the respiratory zone. Unfortunately, not all that air that we breathe in makes it to that point. So we call the conducting zone sometimes our respiratory or anatomical dead space, okay, because it's not really doing anything for us as far as respiration goes. Okay. Now, expiratory reserve volume is the largest additional volume of air that can be forcefully expired after tidal volume air. So after you've exhaled normally, it's a max exhale on top of it. Okay, so if you think about taking a normal exhale and then blow off everything that you can. Okay. Most of us would think, and a lot of kids do, think you completely deflate your lungs, but in all actuality you don't. There is what we call residual volume, and this is the amount of air that's left in our lungs after that expiratory reserve volume has been performed. Okay, so after that max exhale, we're still going to have, and that's about a liter, a little over a liter for both men and women. Okay. Now, ERV is the opposite of IRV, inspiratory reserve volume. This is the amount of air that you can forcefully inspire after a normal inhale. So after you take a normal breath in, then you suck in as much air as you can. Okay, and that's what inspiratory reserve volume is. It's quite a bit higher than your ERV. Okay. Now you can take these volumes and you can calculate capacities. Okay. Inspiratory capacity is tidal volume plus inspiratory reserve volume. Okay. Functional residual capacity is ERV plus RV. Okay. So it's the amount of air that's in your lungs after you take a normal exhale. Okay. Vital capacity is your ERV plus your tidal volume plus your vital capacity or your inspiratory reserve volume. So it's the amount of air that basically, and this one can be measured by breathing in as much air as you can and then blowing off everything that you can. What's left over is just tidal volume or residual volume, excuse me. And then total lung capacity is exactly what it sounds like. It's the maximum amount of air that your lungs can hold. And you can't measure that, you have to calculate that. It's the four volumes added together, or you can just add vital capacity and residual volume to calculate it. Now, do you need to know numbers, or do you need to know how to calculate? The answer to both those questions is no. Okay. When I was in grad school, I took a class, respiratory physiology. We had to know numbers for both men and women. We had to do some calculations. I'll be honest with you, it was a very difficult unit. So I'm not going to make you guys do that for a lower level physiology class. But just know if you end up going into higher level physiology classes, you might have to. I do want you to know the definitions, what these different volumes are, what the different capacities mean. There will be some questions on those. Now, besides calculating capacities and measuring volumes, spirometers can also provide us with additional information about airflow. Okay. The one that is pictured over there on the right is forced expiratory volume, the amount of or volume of air that can be forcibly expired after 1, 2, 3, and even 4 seconds, as it shows over there on the right. Okay. FEV1 is the amount of air that can be blown off after 1 second. So how you measure this? You have the person take a deep breath in, as deep as they can, and then you tell them to blow as hard as they can, as fast as they can. Okay. I grew up with asthma, so I went to the asthma doctor every 6 months or so, and they would do this test on me. I had no idea that's what I was doing, but I remember what they were telling me to do, and so I know this is what they were measuring. Okay. A normal healthy lung, so a normal healthy individual, can blow off just about everything right off the bat within 1 second. But somebody with a condition like COPD, at 1 second, they've barely blown anything off. And then at 4 seconds, as it shows here, they have just now met the amount of air that the normal healthy lung can blow off in a second. Okay. So this is a great diagnostic tool to measure the healthiness or lack thereof of a lung. Okay. The other measurement, and this one's not that important, but would be total minute volume of air moved per minute. Okay. Kind of like cardiac output, except it's air instead of blood. So using some of those things that we were able to calculate with a spirometer, a person might get diagnosed with a lung disease or a pulmonary disease. Okay. And we kind of can classify many of those into restrictive and or obstructive. Okay. Restrictive disorders are those causing an abnormally low vital capacity. If I go back a couple slides, we learned that vital capacity was basically the amount of air you can breathe in. Okay, so it's not going to include what's left in our lungs. It's what we can breathe in from the point after we've forcefully expired everything to the amount that we can completely inspire. So vital capacity can be thought of as the maximum ability to breathe in. So you can think of restrictive disorders as those that affect our ability to inhale. Whereas obstructive are those that cause that abnormally low FEV1, which is the exhaling. So this is more related to inhaling and exhaling. So you could probably imagine that some of these disorders affect both. COPD, literally named chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder or disease, is a disorder characterized by chronic and recurrent obstruction of airflow, increasing airway resistance. COPD disorders are both restrictive and obstructive. Okay. You got bronchitis, where there's excess tracheal bronchial secretions. And basically, they call this sputum, or it's a mucus accumulation, blocking the airways. Okay. You also will see hyperinflation of the alveoli. The alveoli are a little bit extra inflated when you compare them over to here to a normal healthy bronchial tree and alveoli. Okay. Emphysema is something we talked about the other day. Airspace is distal to the terminal bronchioles are enlarged as a result of damage to lung connective tissue. People with emphysema contain abnormally large air spaces in their alveoli, remaining filled with air even during exhalation. It's basically way more ballooned. You guys remember what I said a typical person with emphysema is going to show up as? Well, overinflated chest, or barreled chest, as I like to call it. Okay. And then asthma, as you can see here, is kind of like bronchitis, where you got that mucus, but you notice that it looks like those bronchial tree structures are pinched inward. That's because of smooth muscle constriction. Okay, it's definitely related to allergic reactions that cause the muscle to spasm and constrict. Okay, and so it's an obstructive disorder that affects the ability to breathe in a different manner. Over on the right, table 22.3 is a table actually I snagged from a different textbook. It describes some variations in respiratory rhythm, so it's not necessarily a pulmonary disorder. These are things that we all experience, not all of these, but we've all experienced hyperventilation, hypoventilation. This is something that's very important for regulating pH. You guys remember what prefix hyper and hypo mean? Hyper is high, hypo is low, so hyperventilation would be an increased breathing rate. Well, we all do that when we, start to breathe heavier, like when we're doing something physically active. Okay, we'll all hypoventilate from time to time. Doing certain things will cause us to hypoventilate. Certain conditions will. So we'll talk more about those. Of the other ones listed, probably apnea is something that you may have heard of before, especially if you've ever heard of sleep apnea. This is where people will fall asleep and stop breathing temporarily, hopefully anyway, because that's what apnea is. Jumping in a pool will actually cause apnea if it's really cold. Okay, takes your breath away. It's so cold, it literally will, and it stops you from breathing. Some other respiratory disorders related to hypoxia. Remember, hypoxia is an oxygen imbalance where there's low oxygen levels in our blood. It can occur from a variety of reasons or as a result of a variety of reasons. Hypoxemic, state of low arterial PO2, usually due to inadequate pulmonary gas exchange, can occur going to high elevations or impaired breathing. So like having emphysema might cause you to be hypoxic. Ischemic hypoxia, the word ischemia is a term that describes poor circulation. So you can become hypoxic because of ischemia, inadequate circulation of blood. And then anemic hypoxia is what we talked about previously. Remember, anemia was due to certain things. The most common was iron deficient anemia. Anemic was where you were low in ability to carry oxygen, and so being anemic is definitely going to be associated with hypoxic. So anybody that's anemic is probably going to have at least a mild form of anemic hypoxia. All right, we're going to transition from that sort of stuff now to talking about gas exchange. We're going to talk about gas exchange for probably the rest of today's lecture. Okay. And then the transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide, which is related to gas exchange. You can't transport oxygen or carbon dioxide if you can't exchange it. We learned the other day that the structures in our lungs called alveoli are the site of what we call pulmonary gas exchange or external respiration. Okay. Our alveoli are very numerous. I like to compare them to grapes held in clusters, just like grapes are. Okay. The individual ball-like structures that you see here are the alveoli. The singular form of alveoli is alveolus. Okay. They're held in clusters called sacs. Each sac is like a grape cluster. Okay, and you can think of these alveolar ducts like the stem of a grape cluster. Okay, instead of a stem here, this alveolar duct is an extension of a terminal bronchiole, which is the tip of our tree branches. Okay, so if you have to think of these grapes, instead of growing on vines, they're growing on trees, and the very tips of the tree branches are where they grow, and these are the tips of the tree branches. The little stems are called the alveolar ducts, and instead of being made up of wood, these are tubes to carry air. Okay. Now, pulmonary capillaries surround each one of our alveoli. It doesn't show it in all of our alveolar sacs here. It does only over here, but these would also have a very dense network of blood surrounding them, which is great because that's needed for gas exchange to occur, for oxygen to enter our blood and CO2 to exit the blood. Okay. Now, we learned the structure of capillaries previously, not very long ago, in fact. We talked about that probably last Friday, if I'm remembering correctly. We learned that capillaries were very, very thin. Okay. And therefore, exchange was easy to occur, okay? Especially if you compare them to the thick walls of arteries and less thick, but still thicker than capillaries in our veins. Okay? Well, alveoli are structured very similar to capillaries. Okay? Capillaries were only one cell thick with a basement membrane surrounding it. Alveoli are also only one cell thick with a basement membrane surrounding it. So there's very, very little resistance to gas exchange in a normal, healthy lung. Okay? We call those 4 layers of tissue, the 2 layers associated with the alveoli, the 2 layers associated with the capillaries, the respiratory membrane. And we'll see that more here on the next slide. Okay? The great thing about our lungs, in a normal, healthy lung that is the surface area for gas exchange is extremely high because we have millions upon millions of these little boogers in our lungs. Okay. Let's talk now about the structure of alveoli and the respiratory membrane in a little bit greater detail. All right, I'm going to zoom ahead, actually, to this figure. What we're looking at here is the inside of one singular alveolus. Remember, alveolus is a singular form of alveoli. Okay. We see that it's a hollow structure, kind of like a little balloon. Okay. What I'm going to focus in on are the capillaries surrounding them and the wall, which is primarily formed by what we call type 1 cells, or as it states here, type 1 alveolar cells. These are just like the cells that form the wall of a capillary. They're thin, plate-like, 1 cell layer thick. If we zoom in at the point where an alveolus meets a capillary, what we call the respiratory membrane, which is what we're doing down here, we can see the 4 layers of the respiratory membrane. The type 1 cell, its basement membrane, the capillary endothelium, which is 1 cell thick, and its basement membrane. Those 4 layers represent a diffusion obstacle. For diffusion to occur, they have to travel through those 4 layers. Okay, so they have to cross through. It's an obstacle. The great thing is, this obstacle is pretty much nothing. I want to say it's 0.004 millimeters. It's minuscule. That's in a healthy lung. Guess what happens to a diseased lung? It can get thicker. And that makes diffusion more difficult. And therefore diffusion goes down. And that means less oxygen into our blood. And that's hypoxia. Okay. Now, on top of having type 1 cells, alveoli will also have type 2 cells. Type 2 cells are where we produce surfactant, or are the cells that produce surfactant. Surfactant is a very important fluid that helps reduce surface tension, which is attraction or force of attraction between water molecules of the fluid. Also prevents the alveoli from collapsing as we breathe in and out, keeps them from sticking together, and it even helps promote oxygen diffusion. Okay. There is a third cell. We call those macrophages or death cells. You can see those are the green ones here. Just like the macrophages that we've talked about in our bloodstream or in our lymphatic system, can chew up stuff by phagocytosis, but we're not too worried about those. All right. On Monday, we talked about Boyle's law. Today, we're going to talk about 2 more laws. The second law of this lecture, our first of the day, is Dalton's law, which relates to gas exchange. So let me read through here. Total pressure produced by the atmosphere, what we call barometric pressure, is the sum of the pressures produced by each of its gases. Okay. Because what surrounds us in the atmosphere is not just oxygen, it's not just carbon dioxide, it's a collection of several gases. Predominantly, it's actually nitrogen. 78.6% of the air that we breathe whether that's here in Kansas, whether that's in Denver, whether that's in New Orleans below sea level, that percentage is not going to change. The percentages for all these gases will not change. Okay. Each gas in the mixture exerts its own pressure as if no other gases were present. This is defined as Dalton's law. Okay? And that's what we're showing down here with the table at the bottom. Okay? These individual columns down here on the right demonstrate the pressures of each of the major gases in the air. Okay? Now, at sea level, barometric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. Okay? And that can be calculated by adding all of those pressures up. If you were to pull out your calculators and add up 597.4 plus yada, 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 it would come out to 760 millimeters of mercury. Now, are we concerned about all of these? No, because we're not worried about exchanging nitrogen, nor are we concerned about exchanging water. So we're going to focus in on the PO2, which is the pressure of oxygen, and the PCO2, which is the pressure of carbon dioxide. Okay. And the pressures affect diffusion. Okay. Each gas will diffuse across a permeable membrane from areas where its partial pressure is greater to the area where it is less. The greater the difference, the faster the rate of diffusion. Okay. Now, how many people have been told that there's less oxygen in the air at high altitude? Probably everybody in here, right? Okay, they always say there's less oxygen in the air in Colorado than there is here. People don't know what they're talking about. Okay. There is still 20.9% oxygen in that air, just like it is here. This is not ever going to change. But this will. Because this changes. Guess what happens to barometric pressure when you go to high altitude? Does it go up or does it go down? It's going to go down. So what's that going to do then? If instead of 760, it's 700. 700 times 0.209 is not going to be this high, is it? It's going to be lower. So that reduces the difference, and that therefore reduces the rate of diffusion of oxygen into the body. And that's why if you exercise at high altitude or just go there, you might feel funny, or you might not be able to perform very well. Okay. Now, in an ideal world, gas of interest could be removed from the mixture, measured to determine its own partial pressure. However, you have to take them and add them all together, multiplying just like we're doing here. 0.2093 or 20.93% times 760 will give you the partial pressure of oxygen. Okay, we could do the same thing for the others. But we're going to focus mainly on oxygen and carbon dioxide. There's the third law, Fick's law of diffusion. Now, your book actually talks about a couple other laws, but we're not going to worry about those. Fick's law of diffusion states that the amount of gas moving across a sheet of tissue, so this is just diffusion, because that's what gas moving across a sheet of tissue is, okay, proportional to two things and inversely proportional to one thing. So, proportional means that if one goes up, the other also goes up. Okay. Proportional to the difference in gas partial pressure or the pressure gradient between the two sides. That's what I just said on the previous page. Okay. Think of this like the steepness of a hill. The steeper the hill, there's a difference between the two heights, the top of the hill and the bottom of the hill, the faster the ball will roll if you push the ball down. Okay. That is what we want. That promotes very rapid and very high levels of diffusion. Okay. But when you go to high altitude, guess what happens to the size of your hill? You climb a mountain, your hill actually goes smaller, and diffusion therefore is reduced. And that's why it's harder to breathe, and harder to not necessarily breathe, but feel like you're breathing at high altitude. Okay. It's also proportional to the tissue area. What did we say our lungs are full of? Millions upon millions of alveoli, which is great because now we have a better ability to perform diffusion. Inversely proportional, which means that if one goes up, the other one goes down. So the thicker the tissue area, like we show over here, the less diffusion can be performed. Okay. This is the respiratory membrane that they're showing. Okay. Here's a normal healthy lung. Alveolar wall is thin, so is the capillary wall. Diffusion is easy. Okay. The diseased lung shown over here is increased in size, the respiratory membrane that is. Therefore, diffusion is reduced. Think of it like walking 5 steps versus walking 25 steps. Which one's easier? Which one's faster? Obviously 5 steps, right? So the thicker the tissue area, or the tissue thickness, excuse me, the less diffusion can be performed. All right, our next couple slides, we're going to go through and talk about the 2 types of gas exchanges. Okay. Diffusion that occurs in our alveoli is called alveolar gas exchange, or external respiration. Back and forth movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide across the respiratory membrane. So we're talking alveoli and blood. Okay. This rate of exchange depends on several factors. That partial pressure gradient I've been talking about for several slides now. Okay. Our PO2 is about 104 millimeters of mercury in our alveolar air. It's only 40 in the pulmonary capillaries arriving at that alveolus. You guys would all agree with me that 104 is greater than 40, so that's going to help promote diffusion of O2 into the blood. Now, what do you think happens to this number at high altitude? It goes down. So that draws oxygen out of the blood at a lower rate. Okay. That can be demonstrated with this figure here. Okay. Let's look down here at these 2 slopes, or these 2 lines, and the slope of those 2 lines. Here, at sea level, we said it was a PO2 of 158. The PO2 of our blood arriving at the alveoli is about 40. There's a pretty steep slope here. Normal diffusion occurs. Okay. When we go up in high altitude, so it's kind of backwards here, we would think high altitude would be up here, but high altitude reduces PO2, and our slope is now reduced, so a slower rate of O2 diffusion occurs. Now, if you want to completely change things up, you can jump in a hyperbaric chamber and cause rapid O2 diffusion. But is that something that any of us are probably ever going to experience? Probably not. Diffusion distance, that's what I was just showing you with the figure on the previous page. Okay. A normal healthy lung respiratory membrane is very thin. Diffusion occurs quickly. Also, to help this, the capillaries are so narrow that red blood cells must pass through them in single file, minimizing diffusion distance from the alveolar air all the way into the hemoglobin inside of our red blood cells. Respiratory membrane is essentially a diffusion obstacle, but it's very thin, around 0.004 millimeters. And like I said, pretty much nothing. Membrane surface area. In a good healthy lung, I should say, not health lung, healthy, or in good health, I guess. So in good health, each lung has about 70 square meters of respiratory membrane available for gas exchange. That's an incredible amount. Several pulmonary diseases, though, can decrease this surface area, thus leading to decreased ability to diffuse oxygen. That should say diffuse, not diffusion. Diffuse oxygen. Ventilation perfusion coupling refers to the matching of ventilation or breathing to perfusion, which is blood availability. Okay, because what good is bringing air into the lungs if you're not bringing blood into the lungs for the oxygen to be picked up and CO2 to be released? Okay. So this ensures that areas of the lung with air receive blood. And then solubility of gases is something that we'll talk about here towards the very end of today. And this relates to hemoglobin, which is essential for carrying oxygen in our blood. Okay. This helps the solubility of gases. Okay. Because gases differ in their ability to dissolve in water or blood. Okay. Oxyhemoglobin is the term that we describe hemoglobin with an oxygen or with oxygen molecules bound to it, and deoxyhemoglobin is where it's not. I like to think of the relationship between oxygen and hemoglobin like a piggyback ride. So that would be my analogy. Now, when that oxygen makes its way by way of our bloodstream to our tissues, we now must unload it and do the opposite to CO2, load it. So that's what systemic gas exchange or internal respiration is. Now this is also related to pressure gradients. The partial pressure of blood in our systemic capillaries is higher, 100 millimeters of mercury, than our PO2 of tissues, only 40. 100 is greater than 40, so that's going to promote the moving of O2 from our blood into our tissues. Why does our PO2 of tissue stay low? Even though it's always receiving oxygen, it's always using that oxygen. What do we use oxygen for? Production of ATP, what we call aerobic respiration. What we'll talk about in the last lecture of this unit. Getting into glycolysis, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain, all that stuff everybody loves. Okay. Now, once O2 has dumped itself out of the blood, the PO2 of our venous blood becomes really low. It's now 40, okay, and then that blood's going to end up going back to the lungs, and since that's low, it's going to help perform that alveolar gas exchange. Now, while O2 is diffusing out of the systemic capillary, CO2 is diffusing in the opposite direction, because tissue cells are constantly producing CO2, and that takes place during the Krebs cycle that we'll talk about. PCO2 of cells is 45 milliliters of mercury, higher than that of systemic capillary blood, which is only 40. Now, 45 and 40 are pretty close, but 45 is higher than 40, so that draws the CO2 out of our cells and into the blood. And then that CO2 in our capillaries in our lungs is going to draw it out and into our alveoli and then out of the body. Okay. This rate of gas exchange here is dependent upon those same factors affecting alveolar gas exchange. So pressure gradients, surface area, diffusion distance, that kind of stuff. Here's an image to describe both alveolar or pulmonary gas exchange and systemic or tissue gas exchange. Okay. So let's use oxygen. Okay. Oxygen in our atmosphere, and this is at sea level, remember, its PO2 is 159 millimeters of mercury. Okay. Now, we breathe that in. PO2 in our alveolar air is going to be 105. Okay. So it's going to drop. Now, the blood arriving at our capillary or at our alveoli to feed our alveoli, those pulmonary capillaries, has a PO2 of about 40. 105 is definitely higher than 40. Oxygen is going to rapidly diffuse into the blood. Okay. Now our arterial blood comes back to the heart and then out to our systemic circulation. That PO2 is going to be 100. Our tissues are constantly using oxygen, so they have a low PO2 of about 40. 100 is definitely greater than 40. Oxygen diffuses out into our tissues. Okay. Now, like I said, if we go to high altitude, this number is going to be lower. That number is going to be lower. That number is going to be lower. Therefore, there's less oxygen drive into our cells. And that's what happens when we go to high altitude. Not that there's less oxygen in the air. There's less ability to perform gas exchange. Now, let's start with tissues where CO2 is produced. CO2 levels in our tissues are about 45 millimeters of mercury. The blood that provides our tissues there is only going to have 40 millimeters of mercury of PCO2. So 45 is higher than 40. It's not as great of a pressure gradient, but it's enough to force CO2 out and into the blood. That deoxygenated blood that's eventually going to make its way into our lungs is going to have a PCO2 of 45. Our PCO2 of our alveolar air is 40. So 45 is greater than 40, pushes it into our villi. PCO2 in our atmosphere is only 0.3. 40 is definitely greater than 0.3, so that pushes CO2 out. So it's complicated for something that seems so simple. Breathing in and breathing out. There's a lot going on. Now, what we're going to do for the next several slides, and we're not going to finish this today, is talk about this in between. The transport aspect of things. Because it's not just getting it into the blood, it's carrying it into the blood. Or carrying it, well, just carrying it in the blood. So let's talk first about O2 transport. All right, as a gas enters the blood, so oxygen is a gas, so I can say as oxygen enters the blood, it's immediately dissolved in our plasma. However, plasma is a fluid, so I can say, however, plasma is only able to carry relatively small amounts of gas, or I could say oxygen. Okay. Therefore, in order for mass transport of, let's say, oxygen to occur, the oxygen molecules must bind to chemicals in our blood. Previously, we learned about hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the major chemical carrying oxygen in our blood. Okay. About 98.5% of our oxygen is bound to hemoglobin, forming oxyhemoglobin, which is oxygen bound to hemoglobin. That leaves about 1.5% just straight dissolved in our plasma. Not very significant. Okay. Now, it's important to know that we bind oxygen to hemoglobin in our lungs, but when that blood reaches our tissue cells, oxygen must unload itself or dissociate from hemoglobin so that it can exit the red blood cell and enter our tissues. And that's why I like to think of it like a piggyback ride. Okay? Everybody knows what a piggyback ride is, right? Hop on someone's back and they carry you from point A to point B. Okay. Where you hop on their back is like the lungs. Where you hop off their back is like your tissues. Okay. Now, we're going to talk here in a second about affinity, and I'll talk more about piggyback rides in just a second. Okay. Now, we can measure how much oxygen is in our blood, okay, by doing some calculations. Each gram of hemoglobin can unite with 1.34 mils of oxygen. There's 100, if we take a 100 mil sample of blood, we would find that's generally going to contain about 15 grams of hemoglobin. Okay. High percentage of that will be saturated. Okay. Saturated, or a high percentage is saturated in our arteries. Okay. So you can take 15 for the 15 grams times 1.34, because each gram can carry 1.34 mils. And that calculates out to 20.1 mils of oxygen per 100 ml of blood, or we could say it has 20% blood or volume of oxygen. Now that number can change. If we increase hemoglobin, what's going to happen? So instead of 15, maybe we have 18. You would take 18 times 1.34, that number is going to go up. Makes sense. There's more piggyback rides to be given out. There's more ability to be carried. If there's less, oxygen will be lower. That makes sense. Hopefully, pretty common sense stuff. Now, percent saturation of oxygen or of hemoglobin expresses the average saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen. The average oxygen saturation of hemoglobin in our arteries is almost 100%. It's 97% roughly, which means that 97% of our arterial blood's hemoglobin bound to oxygen. Okay. When people go to the doctor, Emily, you've probably seen this before, working as a CNA, a lot of times a person will get a little clip put on their fingertip. Okay. They call those pulse oximeters. Okay. They're measuring oxygen saturation, or what they call O2 sat a lot of times. Okay. This is what they're measuring right here. Okay. And hopefully that number will be somewhere around 97%. A friend of mine got sick in college. They never really figured out what was wrong with him, but his O2 sats were in the 80s. Definite stuff not going right. He was hacking up actually pieces of lung, it said, because he had such a bad, I think it was just real super bad cold and possibly pneumonia. But they never really did figure it out. Of course, he got better, thankfully. So now, Affinity is something that I like to think of as like how hard and how tightly you hold on to somebody when you're taking a piggyback ride. Okay, you can really hold on tight. Okay, you can really hold on, or you can hold on really loosely. If you hold on really tight, you're more likely to, or you're less likely to fall off. So you're better at loading, but you're reduced at unloading. Okay. And the opposite can be said for if you're holding on loosely, you're less likely to load, you're more likely to unload. Okay. So that's what affinity is. Okay. Several factors affect this: PO2, temperature, pH, and then a chemical that's produced by red blood cells called 2,3-BPG. And I'm not going to try to pronounce the long-winded word there. Okay, it's important to understand that our body's going to dump oxygen to the places that it needs it the most. So our hemoglobin will unload tissues that need it more, like our skeletal muscle during exercise. The most important factor determining how much oxygen binds to hemoglobin is the PO2. Increasing it will accelerate hemoglobin association with oxygen. We call that loading. Decreasing PO2 will accelerate oxygen dissociation with hemoglobin offloading, so falling off of the person's back. The person's jumping on, which is what loading is. Since our active tissues consume oxygen more rapidly, PO2 of our fluid will remain low. Okay. This graph on the next page will demonstrate this concept, what we call the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. Notice that when tissue PO2 is low, hemoglobin will give up oxygen or dissociate it with it more easily than that when PO2 is high. Okay. Because when PO2 is high, hemoglobin binds relatively large amounts of oxygen and is almost 100% saturated. Oxygen consumption by our systemic tissues keeps PO2 very low. Therefore, a pressure gradient will exist to drive oxygen into our systemic tissues. Here are the two graphs that show the same thing, this oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. This one's the one from your textbook. I kind of like this one better because it shows you kind of an analogy that I like. Okay. We can think of this dump truck like our hemoglobin and these little rocks in the back as oxygen molecules. Okay. Our oxygenated blood in systemic arteries, we said, was about 97% saturated with oxygen. Okay. And that means our dump truck is pretty much full of oxygen. Okay. We've loaded in this case. The PO2 in our lungs is about this 105 millimeters of mercury. And that's great because what do we want to do with oxygen and hemoglobin in our lungs? We want to load, right? Okay. Well, our tissues keep a lower PO2. Okay. You notice here the top of our graph is really plateaued, but there's a point where there's a big steep drop. Okay. Now at rest, our tissues keep a PO2 of about 40. And therefore, we're going to dump off oxygen. Remember how I said the other day I don't like the term deoxygenated blood? Right now, you guys are all at rest, and blood is coming back to your heart, still 75% saturated with oxygen. That doesn't sound like deoxygenated to me, does it? Or to you? Okay. What about when we exercise? Our oxygen consumption goes up, therefore PO2 drops. And since we're on the very steep slope, a drop from 40 to 20 makes a huge difference in how much we dump off. Okay. So even when we're doing max exercise, the blood coming back to our heart is still 25% saturated with oxygen. Does that make sense? Now, there are several conditions that can cause the curve to shift this way or this way. Now, shift to the right is going to lower affinity. So there's a less strength to the hold in our piggyback. Okay? This means that there's greater unloading and less loading. Okay? And then a greater affinity is caused by, or it results from a shift left, which promotes loading but causes less unloading. And so we'll talk about the Bohr effect first thing on Monday.